It's time for our notes for part 6. So grab your notebook and write this down in the input side of your notebook. Let's begin. Your essential question for today is to describe the position of the shoulder blade in reference to the hand using terms from these notes. By the time we get through these notes, you will be able to do that. And here's a picture just so you can see. The shoulder blade would be actually inside this picture a little bit, and there's the hand right there. As said, this is the introduction to the human body. This is part 6 of our notes. We have one more section of our notes before we start preparing and studying for a test that we're going to take this Friday. All right, so we're going to continue on with some of the directional terms that we started last time. We'll start over here. We have proximal. Proximal means nearer to the attachment of the limb, such as an arm or a leg, to the trunk. So proximal, if it's closer to the body's trunk, it's proximal, okay? It's in closer proximity. That's why this same root word, proximity, proximal. An example of this is the knee is proximal to the ankle, meaning the knee is closer to the trunk than the ankle. Okay, so here's another word, distal. It's the opposite. This one means farther from the attachment of the limb to the trunk. It's a farther distance from the attachment, okay, distal. And the example of this is the wrist is distal to the elbow. So if we picture that the wrist is up here roughly, the elbow would be right here. So the wrist is farther away from the trunk than the elbow, okay? Next word is medial. Medial, you can kind of figure out what that means. Medium, or in the middle, is nearer to the midline of the body. The heart is medial to the lungs. And the heart here would be underneath the rib cage, and it is closer to the center than what the lungs are. The lungs would be more toward the outside. And lateral is farther from the midline of the body, and your thumb is on the lateral side of your hand. So we see here that the thumb is outside here. It's on the outside of the hand. Now for the body cavities. There are several body cavities that we need to know. The first one we're going to focus on is the dorsal cavity. Then we have the ventral cavity, which is composed of several cavities as well. All right, so let's look at the dorsal body cavity first. Dorsal body cavity is near the dorsal side or the dorsal surface of the body, meaning the back side. There are 2 subdivisions, and the entire dorsal body cavity is lined with a system of membranes called meninges. Okay? The first subdivision that we're going to discuss is the cranial cavity. The cranial cavity is the space that holds your brain, and it is formed by your skull. Here, this is just showing a picture of all of the different parts of the skull, which we're going to learn in more detail later when we study the skeletal system. The second subdivision of the dorsal body cavity is the vertebral or spinal cord. It contains your spinal cord, and it's formed by the vertebral column. Okay, so we're talking cavities here. So the space that's in between, or that that makes up the space that runs down your vertebral column, is called the vertebral column canal, or the spinal cord. The ventral body cavity. The ventral body cavity, as stated, is near your ventral body surface, or your stomach side, or the front side. There are 2 subdivisions of the ventral body cavity as well, and these divisions are divided by the diaphragm, which is your large dome-shaped muscle responsible for your breathing. Organs located in the ventral body cavity are called viscera, and they're covered by serous membranes. All right, let's start on top here, the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity is found above the diaphragm. The thoracic cavity is encircled or protected by the ribs, the sternum, and the vertebral column and muscles. And it's divided into 2 pleural cavities by the mediastinum. Later on in these notes, we'll break down what those 2 things are. And the thoracic cavity contains all thoracic organs except, the mediastinum contains all thoracic organs except for the lungs. Now the second subdivision of the ventral body cavity is the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is really the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, but we run them together because they are connected. This cavity is located below the diaphragm. It's the inferior portion or the lower part of the ventral body cavity, and it is encircled by the abdominal wall, bones, and the muscles of the pelvis. The mediastinum, as mentioned earlier, is the area behind the breastbone. The area behind the breastbone is the midline wall of tissue, and it contains the heart and the great vessels, which is the aorta and the vena cava, and all of those pulmonary blood vessels. Your esophagus, trachea, and thymus are also located in this region right here. The mediastinum runs right down the center. All right, and your serous membranes. Your serous membranes are those thin, slippery membranes that line your body cavities, and they're not open to the outside. We see this example up here, like if you shove your fist into a balloon, it's similar to what it feels like inside the serous membranes. There's no connection to the outside, and there's an inner layer, which is called the visceral layer, and that's the layer that's right around the organs. And then there is also an outer layer called the parietal layer. This is the layer of the serous membrane that lines the cavity. And in between the serous membranes is what's called serous fluid, and it reduces internal friction. And it's a shock reducer in all of the body cavities. The pleural and pericardial cavities, these are specific to your lungs and your heart. The visceral pleura, which is the serous membrane that clings to the surface of your lungs, you can see it here, it's the inner layer that's wrapping around the lungs. And the parietal pleura, it lines your chest wall. The visceral pericardium is the membrane that surrounds the heart itself, and the parietal pericardium lines your pericardial sac. So it is the external membrane. The peritoneum, this would be the visceral peritoneum is the serous membrane that covers your abdominal organs or your abdominal viscera. So this is the visceral peritoneum down here. And all of your internal organs, your abdominal organs, they're all together in this same serous membranes, in this serous sac. And then you have the parietal peritoneum, which is the serous membrane that lines your abdominal wall. Okay, so lastly here, we have the abdominal pelvic regions and the quadrants. Your abdominal pelvic region, we've seen this picture before, contains, it's divided into these 9 different regions. And these different regions are helpful for medical personnel to be able to identify, like if you're feeling pain in a certain region, they can kind of figure out which organ is being affected, or which organ is swelling up or something like that, by how they do the palpitations and how they listen to your stomach. All right, so let's run through these real quick. We have the right hypochondriac region, the epigastric region, that's kind of like where your stomach is, gastric, the left hypochondriac region, the right lumbar region, which is near the lower part of your back, called the lumbar portion of your back, the umbilical region, which covers where your belly button would be, the left lumbar region, the right iliac region, it's right over that iliac bone, and the hypogastric region in the center, and then the left iliac region. And your abdominopelvic region is also divided into 4 quadrants, with the right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, left lower quadrant, and right lower quadrant. And those are also very useful subdivisions and trying to figure out different diagnosis and stuff like that whenever you are being assessed as a patient. All right, well, that concludes our notes for today. Go back and answer that essential question. I think you can do it with the notes that you just took. And hey, I will see you in class very soon. Have a good one.